Hi, everyone, and welcome to another one of our webinars in our series, How To. And today, really our focus is on a really fast-growing market for unmanned systems. So we're excited about getting deep on this topic, one that I know I need to learn a lot about, so I'm looking forward to uh, learning alongside all of you. So let me go ahead and jump in. I wanted to first introduce really our key speaker today, who's going to be guiding us through the market and use cases, and that's Tate Nurkin. Tate's the CEO and founder of the OTH Intelligence Group, and OTH stands for Over the Horizon, and he's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Welcome, Tate.
Yeah, thanks, Raj. Great to be here.
Great. Tate's joining us from London today, so I know he's out there, so it's a little late there. So thank you, or it's dinner time, I guess, over there. So thanks for joining. And Tate will tell us a bit more about his background and as we jump in. And I'm Raj Sharma. I'm the CEO and founder of Public Spend Forum, and many of you may know me. I'm leading up really globally. Working with governments around the world on how we can improve public procurement, which also includes, how we work with different markets like unmanned systems. So let me go ahead and jump in. Actually, let me just say one thing that Eunice also mentioned. We love to get questions, and we want to make this as interactive as you can on a webinar. So please do feel free to ask questions in the chat. Or in the questions area, and I'll be facilitating this, so I'll make sure that we can get those questions in while we're talking, so we don't want to wait till the end. So please feel free to ask any questions, and I'll relay them to Tate as we go through. So today our objectives, first of all, our audience for these webinars is typically both government program as well as contracting professionals programs, because they're the end users, and many times they're doing a lot of market research and trying to understand the market and how best to go to market and who are the companies that are out there. And then contracting professionals, of course, they're working with the government program. So that's our intended audience. And the topics, again, you'll hear Tate talk about. One, we want to make sure we all have a common understanding of what unmanned systems means. I'll tell you, I've learned a bit just in the past a few weeks, and Tate's really a renowned expert in this area, so he'll help us gain that understanding. And then understand what are the use cases, because it's important to start with use cases, right? And why is government, for instance, using unmanned systems? Why are they important? For what missions, right? And so we'll talk a lot about that, because that's really important before we can go out and then understand the market and make sure it helps us meet whatever needs that we're trying to meet. So those are some of the topics we'll be covering. Before we jump in and I hand it over to Tate, I just want to give you kind of just a couple of minutes here really quick. First, tell you about our sponsor, and thank you to Ivalia. Ivalia, if you don't know, is a e-procurement platform. Its procure-to-pay suite is being used by governments and commercial enterprises all over the world. And so in government, recently they've signed Maryland, Ohio, federal government of Canada, New York City. So I'd encourage you to check them out, and thank you again to Ivalia for making these webinars and some of our other programming possible. About Public Spend Forum, really quick, if you don't know, you can go to publicspendforum.net and find all sorts of information on markets, as well as different tools and practices that we're populating on a regular basis. We have thousands and thousands of users from across the world and coming to us, and we're excited to really help grow some of the knowledge that we're sharing. And then lastly, before we go to Tate, is GovShop. GovShop, if you don't know, is a free supplier research platform. We are building some of the data around unmanned systems and drones, and I'll show you that a little bit at the end. But it's a free platform that you can go in and search for suppliers for all sorts of markets, and especially emerging tech. So we'll talk a bit about that later. But with that, I'd like to just go ahead and jump in. Tate, thanks again for joining today, and I'm excited to learn about, how the market for unmanned systems is structured and how we should be thinking about it.
Great. Well, thanks, Raj. Thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about unmanned systems and some of the work I do in that area, and of course, to be a part of the exciting and valuable things you're doing at Public Spin Forum. This is really been looking forward to this, and I'm excited that it's here. So very quickly, a little bit on my background. I've spent the last 22 or so years working predominantly as a consultant or advisor into the U.S. and some allied and partner defense and intelligence and security communities, looking largely at three kind of overlapping issues. The first, and I think certainly most relevant to this discussion today, is how some of these emerging technologies and fourth industrial revolution technologies are affecting the future of defense and security capabilities and requirements and competitions. The second area is closely related to that, is what it means for the defense industry and security industry. And then lastly, I spend a lot of time looking at U.S.-China military technological competition as well. So those three topics tend to overlap quite significantly. Today I want to talk largely about some of the big trends shaping the future of the unmanned systems market. Now, as you probably guessed from my introduction, most of my research, not all, is focused on defense and security issues. And so this brief does have a little bit of a defense and security feel to it. That said, I'm going to take some time throughout and certainly welcome questions throughout to try and pause and help articulate some of the ways in which the trends, intentions, and uncertainties we have in this brief really apply to kind of the civil and commercial markets as well, because I think conceptually there's a lot of consistency between the military and security market and other markets for unmanned systems. And speaking of concepts, I want to start the conversation today by introducing three, again, pretty broad concepts that I think both individually and collectively really help bound and describe what's going on in the unmanned systems market today. And again, this applies probably most intensely to the military market, but all of these concepts apply to civil and commercial and law enforcement and even personal use markets. And the first one is velocity. I mean, there's a real momentum to this market. There's a lot going on, and that's a lot going on from a demand side. There are more and more ways in which unmanned systems are being integrated into military security operations as well as civil and commercial. And so that has really created a lot of momentum for the industry. Now, there are some constraints, and we're going to talk about what those are today that could slow some of this velocity in the market, but I don't think it will arrest that momentum. I don't think it will arrest that velocity. I think you'll continue to see pretty good upward growth in terms of the overall market and the number and the range of applications for unmanned systems. As a result, the industry is responding with a pretty impressive volume of output. Now, some of this is to direct requirements that are coming from state and local governments, from law enforcement, from military and security communities, but some of it is just innovative new approaches to unmanned systems that companies are trying or believe will create new markets or supplant current solutions. So we have velocity, we have volume, and I think tied to both of those is variety. Part of the challenge, which we'll get to on the next slide, of talking about the unmanned systems market is defining what it is you're talking about, because there are just so many of these systems that are now being brought to market and actually being deployed, again, by military, security, commercial, and civil organizations. Next slide.
Great. Let me just go ahead. Even as I switch, Tate, one question I have. I know this is probably due to my lack of understanding, but I wonder if kind of on the part of the audience as well. But
Yeah.
could you just, I know you already covered this, unmanned systems, but I always was using the term drones.
Right.
Or could you just differentiate the two? I think I understand, but it would be great for you to just kind of just give us a little bit of that definitional understanding.
Sure. I think the terms are frequently used sort of interchangeably. I think sometimes drone has a connotation of kind of that's not positive, but it still gets used, I think, interchangeably with unmanned systems. I prefer unmanned systems. It's a little bit more formal and I think a little bit more descriptive. And I think it's actually a great question to kind of segue into. And actually, drones is also more typically used in terms of unmanned aerial systems than an unmanned systems is a much broader category than just UASs or UAVs. And again, there's some terminology and some lingo here that is important to clarify. Yeah. Again, I tend to use unmanned aerial systems. The vehicle is the platform basically, but it's important to talk about the whole system. So we'll use unmanned aerial systems or unmanned systems throughout the course of this brief.
Great. No, I think that was helpful.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, so that's, like I said, a good segue to this particular slide, which looks at 6 different kind of ways to think about the market. Now, these are clearly not mutually exclusive. Indeed, there's a lot of overlap across many, if not all of these, but it's worth kind of, again, elucidating the ways that different organizations talk about and segment this market. One way is just kind of at a very high level. Military, commercial, and civil should be in here as well, and then personal use. The military and security market has a huge chunk of this, and different organizations, again, calculate that differently. I've put about 70%, which feels of the total global market for unmanned systems. It feels about right and is the most commonly cited range. But as the market grows, it will grow fast across each of these categories, and maybe that number comes down a little bit, although again, demand in the military market is also growing simultaneously with these other ones. The DoD actually in 2010 released a sort of a way to categorize unmanned systems that was almost exclusively focused on, well, a combination of size, so what's its takeoff maximum weight at takeoff, in combination with operating altitude and speed, and it had different categories that are sometimes still referenced. What you probably hear more of in the military and even in the security and law enforcement space are references to operating altitude and kind of context. So at the bottom of this third silo is HAIL, which is high altitude, long endurance, which is basically systems that operate essentially 30,000 feet or so or higher, including all the way up to about 70,000 feet. And we'll have an example later in this brief of a platform that can stay up in the air for a very long period of time. At least that's the concept behind it. It flies at 70,000 feet. It's almost like a satellite in its functioning, although clearly not in low Earth orbit. Medium altitude, long endurance, again, 10 to 30,000 feet about in terms of the altitudes that they operate in. And these MAIL and HAIL platforms are bigger. They're bigger and more expensive. They're more sophisticated pieces of machinery in a lot of cases, with a longer sustainment tail as well. Tactical, again, operate a little bit below 10,000 feet, and personal are the types of unmanned systems that can basically be carried in knapsacks or used by individuals for personal protection or personal or surveillance in urban and closely contested environments.
So would you, sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
But one question about that between, I guess, and there's military applications, some of the kind of the ones you were describing, they fly high up and they probably have a big payload and can stay up for a long time. But which ones of these, like when you're talking about, I know applications in like state, local, that might be used for, say, emergency recovery or disaster recovery, sorry. Where do those fit in? Is that tactical versus MAIL or?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the MAIL and HAIL are pretty expensive platform or systems. So yes, those could have applicability, just like satellites can help with environmental monitoring imaging and site monitoring and things like that. But again, that there's a little bit more of an investment in getting a mail or hail system up and maintaining it. So I think you're seeing at the local law enforcement level, we have some examples in this brief of the use of sort of personal and tactical unmanned systems that monitor crime scenes or potentially track suspects, things like that. Although again, there's some ethical concerns about how those are deployed. So it's really, I would say, most often at a slightly lower altitude and therefore slightly lower cost that you would see the state and local, but doesn't have to be that way.
Great.
Type fixed wing, so just a typical sort of airplane type design. Rotary wing, so basically helicopter design or quadcopter designs. And there's again a value versus volume here that goes to basically the hail mail, which are fixed wings aircraft. You get a lot of really high profile, high value missions out of those. But there are fewer of those because they're more expensive to make and more expensive to buy. As I mentioned, unmanned systems are carrying out a lot more missions both in the military context and outside of that context. ISR is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And again, this has applications well beyond just the military domain. Data and communications links, unmanned systems are being used increasingly to facilitate communications and the passing of data. Electronic warfare in sort of one of the big, I would say, growing areas of competition between militaries around the world is in the electromagnetic spectrum and electronic warfare. And again, unmanned systems are beginning to take on those roles a little bit more prominently. You think about aircraft like the Boeing the FA-18, the Super Hornet, which is a fighter aircraft, but there's a variant of it that does electronic warfare missions. Not to say that the E-18 isn't going to continue to be a part of the force, but again, it's cheaper to have potentially unmanned systems doing some of those missions. We are talking more and more about strike, and that is military strikes coming from unmanned systems. Environmental monitoring is an interesting area. Academia, for applied research, for businesses, for civil organizations, being able to monitor an area and understand when the environment has changed, or when a site in particular, when things around the sites have changed, is becoming a really interesting area of application for unmanned systems. Delivery and transport as well. We've started to see more and more talk of actualizing unmanned taxis, although it may be a few years off in the future. There's still certainly a lot of investment in this area. And then battle damage assessment is another one from a military context, which again, you can begin to think of other ways in which that might be applied outside of the military context, just again, more closely aligned with environmental monitoring. And then last but not least, and I tended to this to the question on drones, unmanned systems are not just unmanned aerial systems or unmanned aerial vehicles. We see a growth in both the demand and supply signals for unmanned surface vehicles, which are those unmanned systems that operate on the surface of the sea, unmanned ground vehicles, and then unmanned underwater vehicles. And these can be, as we'll talk about in a minute, a lot of these are remote controlled, some are autonomous, but again, there's a lot of innovation, a lot of velocity across each of these sort of domain areas, and that's not just in the military domain. Next slide. Yeah, and one of the things that we sort of added to this brief, just because so often the conversation around something like unmanned systems, and particularly because we're going to talk about some of the technology trends in unmanned systems, it's important to kind of disaggregate three important terms. And if we start actually on the right, technologies are interesting. Autonomous unmanned systems is a really interesting technology area. But technologies themselves don't constitute capabilities. In order to go from technology to capability, there are a lot of other sort of innovations that have to take place beyond the technical ones. And we'll talk about the full list of those at the end of this brief, because some of those are really are areas of constraint on the market, or potentially areas of constraint on the market. But when you, as program managers or individuals in the government, think about, hey, we need to go out and procure an unmanned system, the first thing you should think about is this thing effects, which again is sort of, that's what you want to achieve. And then you can work back from there to what sort of capabilities do we need, and then in order to achieve those capabilities, what sorts of enabling technologies are required. But I think it's important because so often this conversation gets caught up in just the technology side without really thinking about, hey, that's a cool technology, but we need to achieve something very specific here. And that technology, there's a lot of things that need to be done to that technology in order to make it a capability that can achieve that specific effect. Next slide.
Great. By the way, this is very helpful. I think one of the big things, I'm not sure, Tate, if you hear this from your kind of through your interactions and clients, is you know, when we're going to market, right, really having a clear understanding of the problem, at least the way kind of I like to describe it, as what's you know, what we say mission, or what problem we're trying to solve, right?
Right.
And how, you know, like, let's make sure we're clear on that. And I think you're capturing that here in effects. And then, you know, then let's think about, you know, what capabilities and solutions and technologies are out there in the market, as opposed to kind of starting with a solution in mind first, which oftentimes happens, right? And so I think this is great guidance here.
Yeah, well, thanks. And I, you know, it may be intuitive to some, but I think we all have seen examples, both historic examples and maybe in our own professional lives, where that first step of thinking through what is it that we're actually trying to achieve here either didn't happen or wasn't thought through fully, and sort of tried to get past that and get to the kind of cool technology area without really thinking through that first step.
Yeah, and that's great. Well, let me just go to the next slide here.
Yeah, sure. I want to talk through a few of the big technology and demand trends that are shaping this market. And again, the examples will focus largely on military and law enforcement kind of examples, but these trends are applicable across civil and commercial as well. And the first one, because I think we hear more and more about it, certainly in the defense world, about automated unmanned systems. So this is the integration of artificial intelligence, neural networks that enable these systems to operate without either without human intervention at all, or with greatly reduced human intervention. And we're seeing that in the military space become an important trend. I mean, we've seen a lot of focus on increased autonomy in unmanned aerial vehicles. A couple of other great examples, there are programs in the United States and in the United Kingdom looking at large unmanned underwater vehicles, so full-size subs that operate autonomously. This is kind of a huge capability that you know, most of the unmanned systems that are underwater now are much smaller. I'm talking about a full-size sub, and you can see in this quote to the right, comes from the UK Ministry of Defence request for information to industry, which was released in April of 2019, saying that you know, the MOD is looking for a flexible UUV capable of hosting different payload sensors, which will be utilized in a range of testing scenarios. So that term flexible comes up a lot in this brief. It comes up in a lot of the conversations about unmanned system. I think it's reflective of those three concepts we had: velocity, volume, and particularly variety at the start of the brief. By the way, China is also developing a large unmanned underwater autonomous vehicle that is expected to come into service early to mid 2020s. Swarms is another area where there's been a lot written and a lot of discussion about not just single autonomous unmanned systems, but actually having groups of unmanned systems operate in close conjunction with one another, network to one another, working with one another to carry out a specific mission. And again, this is something that is particularly prominent in the military field, but you know, I've certainly read about the concept being applied to agriculture, being applied to other industries as well. China, the China Electronics Technology Group Corporation, CETC, tested in June of 2017, the largest ever network drone swarm. It was 119 unmanned aerial vehicles, all networked together. And this image to the right is actually something that took place in May of 2018. These are 56 unmanned surface vehicles, which were, again, swarmed together. They were networked together, and they formed a number of different shapes, and including the Chinese characters for military-civilian fusion, which is one of the really key components of China's military modernization, which allows it to take civilian technologies and apply them to the military sector. So clearly, some military focus, even though this was done by a private company that's outside of China's defense industrial base. But it's not just China and the U.S. Back in February of this year, the former Minister of Defense in the United Kingdom said that he hoped to get drone swarms deployed by the end of 2019. They since walked back that statement because that's not even the case in the United States and China, where the research is moving the fastest. But there have been significant investments, $2.5 million in March of 2019 through something called the Defense and Security Accelerator in the UK, which again endeavors to bring commercial organizations or non-traditional defense organizations into the defense industrial base. This was awarded to a company called Blue Bear Research Systems to do some work on drones. So a lot going on in terms of networking drones to carry out singular missions. And some of the challenges here, by the way, it's getting the drones to not just talk to one another, because we can see that that can happen, but to do that in kind of a contested environment, and to sort of up the game of the AI itself to get it to move quickly in these fast-moving contested environments is an area that I think there's still a lot of research to be done. Next slide. If these unmanned systems in the air, on the ground, at sea, if they are to be more autonomous, then another sort of long pole in the tent for the future of this market is getting those autonomous systems to work closely with humans. One of the really interesting insights that comes out in discussions of unmanned systems is that humans are still a big part of the unmanned systems operations, currently through remotely piloted vehicles, but also through working in conjunction with these systems in combat or in missions. And this image to the right is an artist rendering of a DARPA program called Offset, which is, again, designed to figure out ways to develop and demonstrate novel interaction modalities and interface technologies for enhanced human swarm teaming. So dismounted, in this case, dismounted troops being able to communicate with up to about 250 different small drones that are networked to one another and then to the dismounted troops. It's a really interesting area of development. And again, it's something that we've seen in terms of other concepts or other concepts being introduced to facilitate this. Here in the U.S. and in Australia, there's something called the low-cost attributable aircraft, which is an autonomous aircraft that is low cost, so it can be not expendable, but there's less risk in using it. But the next step in this program is something called loyal wingmen, which means that a manned aircraft can interact with these unmanned autonomous aircraft more or less seamlessly, kind of maybe not in an exact mothership fashion, but close to it. And the French and German are exploring, sixth generation combined fighters exploring that concept as well. Next slide. Persistence, endurance, and survivability. I group these areas together, and I hope it'll be clear once we're off this slide as to why. But endurance and persistence, so the idea that you can get an unmanned system to stay out, whether it's up in the air or at sea, under the sea, on the ground, that it can stay out longer, that it can deal with harsher environmental and weather conditions, and that it has more power and energy to stay up in the air for longer periods of time. And we'll talk about it a little bit more later in the brief, but this has really created some very novel approaches to power and energy for unmanned systems, including solar power for really high-flying unmanned systems and other interesting hybrid solutions. I group that with survivability because, again, the objective here is to keep unmanned systems operating. whether it's because of weather or because of contested airspace. And again, in the military domain, there are a lot of counter unmanned aerial system capabilities and actually unmanned surface vehicle systems that are being deployed. The picture in the top left of this of all of these pictures is something called the Silent Hunter, which is it's a ground-based weapon, but it's a directed energy weapon that is used for close-in defense of fixed positions. And it shoots drones out of the sky, basically. The middle one is something called the Rex-1, which is a handheld jamming weapon that the Russian military is training with and is likely to be deployed across the ground forces in the Russian military. And then the image to the right is actually another jamming weapon. It's that was used by Chinese police, again, in a civil function, to bring down a drone that was hovering over a soccer stadium. And I think many of you may be aware that it was late last year. Gatwick Airport was shut down because of a couple of drones that were flying over the runway in the airspace. Eventually, the UK MOD used an Israeli solution that again used jamming technology to bring the drones down. So a lot going on in this space. The final picture is actually of a stealth drone that China is developing. Russia has demonstrated something similar, and the United States has its own stealth drone program as well, although that program's objectives have changed considerably since it was first envisioned. Next slide.
Can I ask one thing?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just curious, kind of given the complexity here and the different applications and the technologies being developed all over the world, are you seeing it? I'm guessing in the military arena, especially, there's probably some national security considerations in terms of where you buy from and which partners, right? Absolutely, and I think we'll get to that either on the next slide or maybe one after that. But yeah, that's a really big concern, particularly with the military sort of, let's just say, technological competition between the United States and China, because so much of the commercial market is dominated by Chinese companies. And again, we have an example later in the brief that will kind of bring that to light. But I will say this unmanned systems versus counter unmanned systems. I talked earlier about constraints that might slow the development of the market, and that to me is a big one. There is this sort of hand over hand on the baseball bat sort of competition that is starting to really pick up steam between counter unmanned systems and unmanned system survivability. That is certainly worth watching, not just again in the military space, but also in the civil and commercial space, because as these systems get deployed more and more by non-military organizations, these technologies are not always just military technologies, and they certainly can proliferate rather quickly. Great.
Next. Yeah, so here's some more technology trends. Enhanced sensing is a big one. Next generation sensing, including some new technologies like gallium nitride, but really across all of the areas of demand for unmanned systems, the ability to put better sensors and lighter weight sensors onto aircraft or ships or ground vehicles, unmanned systems, is a really big priority. And indeed, enhanced sensors and smart sensors are one of the really important technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution. There's a lot of innovation going on here, and being able to marry up that innovation with innovation in unmanned system design, I think, is a really interesting area where there's a lot of innovation going on. The next one, multi-role, multi-mission, modular unmanned systems. This keeps coming up, this idea of flexible. I'll have this quote from IAI, which is an Israeli aerospace company who makes a family of unmanned aerial systems called the Heron. And back, it was either late last year or earlier this year, they introduced something called the Heron T, which is the Heron Tactical, which was a new design. But their whole argument for creating this design and integrating with the other family of Heron vehicles is that they needed to increase the flexibility. So a flexible design that rounds up the range of operational UAS solutions that this company offers to all forces on the battlefield, marine, air, ground, and intelligence. So either individual vehicles or families of vehicles with very similar designs that you can just plop in different payloads in to carry out more than one mission, which increases its value and its efficiency. And we see this in terms of the growing demand for strike ISR assets, so platforms and systems capable of performing ISR missions and then acting on those missions and not having to phone home to get someone to follow up. So you see a lot of these, these systems now being able to do a lot of different things, depending on the payloads that they carry. Next slide.
Great. And by the way, I just want to remind everyone, please submit any questions, et cetera. I know we've had one that I've kind of answered, but if there's any other questions, please just chime in.
Great. Yeah, so again, on the design side, so we've hinted at this a couple of times. One of the big challenges for unmanned systems across the board is balancing size, weight, and power, along with cost. So SWAP C, size, weight, and power, and then cost. Sorry, just go back up quickly. So in order to be able to do all of these things that we've talked about and to stay in the air longer, to carry different payloads, to be more robust and to have, now countermeasures to counter UAS or unmanned system technologies, that does add cost, and it may change the design, and it may change the weight of these systems, which again can maybe slow it down, make it less fast, less sustainable in the air. One way of getting around that is a really interesting area of innovation is in materials and designs. This image at the top of the screen is the Wingloon 1D. It's a Chinese made unmanned aerial system that in October of last year, they successfully test flew this aircraft, which has an all-composite fuselage. So it's lighter weight, enables longer, it enables persistence and endurance. So an interesting development in sort of the design and materials phase. This phase of 35 solar-powered unmanned aerial vehicle, it can fly about 70,000 feet is the concept. The U.S. Air Force is interested in it because it's that high up and it's solar powered. It can stay in the air for very, very long periods of time. And then I think most interestingly, or maybe humorously, but I think also a really interesting trend in unmanned systems design is biomimicry. And this image at the bottom is, it looks like a snow owl because that's what it's designed to be. It's an unmanned system that looks like a snow owl. It's designed to perform surveillance in Siberia and some of these cold places in Russia. And this is a trend that is not just unique to Russia. You can see here's a quote from the organization in South Korea that runs acquisition and procurement, that biomimetric robots will be a game changer in future warfare, and I'd argue well beyond future warfare in all the areas that we're talking about here in this brief. And related technologies are expected to bring about great ripple effects throughout the defense industry. We have seen biomimetric unmanned systems, particularly sort of unmanned underwater vehicles that are shaped like tunas, so they can navigate close-in spaces a little bit better. But the idea is that nature develops certain efficiencies that can be replicated in these unmanned systems. And we also see academic institutions like the University of Toronto, for example, is developing unmanned systems that mimic the flight, the wing patterns of gulls in order to allow them to be more energy efficient and stay in the air longer. Next slide.
By the way, Tate, there's a question I just wanted to read out. It's from Anne. Hi, Anne. Anne Laurent. The question is, which programs are buying drones, and which of the, so I'm guessing that's in the Defense Department or in the government, federal government. Yeah. Which programs are currently buying drones, and which of the innovation brokers are buying them? So others can potentially piggyback. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there isn't a one-size-fits-all drone procurement strategy within the Department of Defense. So the services go out and buy their own systems, which is good, but in some respects because it allows them to meet the requirements and achieve the effects that they know they need to achieve. But clearly, coordination across is important, and we do see some some systems that are purchased by both, and you can get some economies of scale there. But there are a lot of different organizations involved in the procurement of unmanned systems across the federal government and DoD in particular. So that might be one to follow up individually with Ann. I can follow up individually with Ann on rather than go through that whole list, which I couldn't do the exhaustive list from memory anyway. So I hope that's helpful.
Great. Okay. And then there's another question. What's the relationship between unmanned systems as we know them and the numerous efforts to introduce autonomy into many systems? Can the capabilities of unmanned systems be simply transferred to others?
So I don't know if I fully understand the question, but that's, I think I can have a swipe at it. I mean, unmanned systems as we know them are going to change with the introduction of more and better AI in their operations. That is, when we talked about more autonomous vehicles. Now, not every unmanned system is going to be autonomous over the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, there is a process here that will need to be that will not be immediate, but you will start to see more integration of this, which will, I think, improve some of the capabilities. And we've got a slide at the end that talks a little bit about some of the constraints on autonomy and other some of these other technological trends. So I don't know. I hope that answers part of the question at least.
Okay, great. And you can definitely follow up with Ann as well.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea on a number of fronts. Thank you. Thanks for the questions.
Let me go to the next slide then. I know
next slide.
It's on the market here. Sorry, I'm having a little difficulty. There you go.
Yeah, and these are a little bit of supply side trends, and yeah. So the thing to stress is because of this velocity, volume, variety, all this interest in different types of unmanned systems, it's really become a pretty competitive market. And this picture is actually of Chinese, sort of a Chinese industry booth that I took when I was at the Unmanned exhibition in Abu Dhabi back in 2018. Every other year they have the Unmanned exhibition there, so they'll have it again in 2020. It's a great exhibition. But you see more and more sort of non-traditional Western competitors at these exhibits, and indeed, especially in the Middle East, where the willingness of China and others to share technology and to offer co-production and some of these other deals that these other sort of good prices, co-production, work share, and technology has led to a really competitive environment. The second picture here is really hits that home, and there's more sort of local partnerships now. Again, China, one of the most notable ones is China basically outsourcing manufacturing to the Saudis, coming to a deal with Saudi Arabia that their CH-4 drone will be made in Saudi Arabia, and then that will be the hub for distribution across the Middle East, where China's drone sales have picked up appreciably over the last several years. So really some interesting things going on, and we'll get to one more sort of competitive trend here on the next slide. It's also worth noting that at least in the military perspective on these big projects, these hail and mail capabilities that again require a lot of technological integration, there are some regional projects. This is a picture of something called the Euro drone, which the EU dedicated 100 million euros to earlier this year. Collaboration between the French, the Spanish, and I think the Italians. I don't know if the Germans are in or not, but Belgium is an observer in that. So these kind of big regional projects outside of the United States that will, that can, especially in Europe, for high value drones and unmanned systems. Next slide. And so this is it's kind of one of the really interesting areas that I'm trying to dig into more and more, is just whether or not there is a two-way street between the commercial and military and security manufacturers and providers of unmanned systems. we've seen over the last decade or so, one of the really interesting trends in global security is the dual utilization of technology. That is, the fourth industrial revolution technologies that are of interest to all of the big industries, to energy, to aerospace, to automotive, to maritime. These are, of course, the same technologies that are driving the future of military capabilities. Unmanned systems, robotics, unmanned systems, cloud computing, AI, quantum computing and encryption, neuro and bioscience, smart sensors, advanced materials, new power and energy. These are all things that are of interest across the board. So while the applications of some of these technologies will vary by industry, the core technologies and science is of interest to all of them. So we do see some integration, some sort of expanding of the unmanned systems industry with which the federal government and I suspect state and local government deals with to kind of smaller commercial firms, not just the big primes, although they still maintain a very active portfolio within the federal government. So there is some of that. There is some of these companies having new opportunities to sell drones, particularly unmanned systems, particularly unmanned personal use systems and tactical systems. And I think one of the interesting things that you referenced earlier, Raj, which is worth calling out here, is that DJI, which is the big Chinese manufacturer of unmanned aerial systems, and owns about 70% of the total market. And in China, the other manufacturers in the market, many of the other more successful ones are Chinese manufacturers as well. Back almost exactly 2 years ago, the U.S. Army had a cease and desist order to all personnel to stop buying DJI off-the-shelf, DJI drones as commercial off-the-shelf because of concerns over cybersecurity. In other words, that all the images that these drones were taking were being stored outside of the United States on Chinese servers, which of course, even 2 years ago was a national security concern within the Department of Defense. We've also seen other branches of the U.S. government, Department of Treasury, I believe maybe release concerns over DJI equipment and the cyber vulnerabilities, sort of a Huawei light sort of type approach to DJI, although that's really at the federal level. At the state and local level, we've seen, for example, the New York Police Department has procured a handful of DJI drones. And the pushback on that procurement was not that they were Chinese made and manufactured. It was, do we trust the New York Police Department to use these in a responsible and ethical manner? So there are a couple of different approaches here, just as there are a couple of different approaches to Huawei and to broader technological engagement with Chinese companies. But there's a lot of sensitivity within the defense community about bringing in that company in particular from the cybersecurity side. There have been some opportunities. Defense contractors themselves, there was a period of time about 4 or 5 years ago when they were looking at adjacent markets to go out and sell unmanned systems to Chevron or Exxon or whoever, particularly companies that were operating in the Arctic where very difficult environment, maybe unmanned systems could operate there more effectively than manned systems and do environmental monitoring and all sorts of things. Not to say that hasn't continued a little bit, but it's not quite the priority it used to be. What you do see more of is commercial providers coming into the military space. This article from earlier this year, one of the non-Chinese companies in the commercial drone space is a French company called Parrot, which was selected to develop a small surveillance aircraft for the U.S. military. And you can see some of the parameters of that procurement. So it's a small aircraft that, again, commercial companies can produce pretty easily. We're also seeing some of the big defense contractors begin to acquire either applied research groups or small commercial companies. BAE Systems earlier this year, I think, acquired a company called Riptide, which does unmanned underwater vehicles in order to kind of diversify their designs. So some interesting trends on the supply side that are worth watching as well. Next slide. So I want to finish, this is the last slide, and we'll maybe stick on it for a couple minutes because there's a lot to kind of sink our teeth into here. But I want to finish with kind of talking about the uncertainties, and I've referenced constraints a couple of times throughout this brief. And just kind of go back to that, you don't need to scroll back to it, Raj, but just go back in our minds to the slide that had effects capability and technology. And here are some areas where I think that where those transitions, both from technology to capability and capability to effect, can be really challenged. And we'll start with exploitation. At that UMAX exhibit, I showed you the picture from earlier. They actually have a conference the day before, and a lot of U.S. senior military officers and allied and partner military officers show up at this, and some from across the Middle East. And one of the common themes there was that, look, in order for unmanned systems to be effectively leveraged, and this goes for military and other markets as well, you need the capabilities to exploit the information that they provide. And currently there is so much information that is being delivered by these systems that it's almost impossible for humans to keep up. So we see the integration not just of artificial intelligence in the autonomy application, but also of machine learning and deep learning to the information and data sets that these systems are collecting. Within the defense space, there have been a couple of efforts at this, one of which Google ran for a while and stepped away from, sort of famously last year, highlighting another of the challenges of exploiting unmanned systems, is that sometimes you get companies that are outside the traditional defense industrial base that are not always comfortable with supporting the defense, supporting the defense community. Culture and organization is another one where, you have to, the U.S. Air Force, for example, struggled for many years once it became clear that unmanned systems were going to be a prominent component of future conflict. They still struggled from a culture and organization standpoint. There's been some great research done by Dr. Adam Stuhlberg at Georgia Tech and Dr. Michael Salomon at Georgia Tech, who looked at this and all the challenges that came with what they call the white scarf culture of fighter pilots getting promotions and things like that. So this could constrain, particularly as unmanned systems begin to proliferate outside of militaries that have started to use them and into different state and local governments or commercial areas. How do you incorporate unmanned systems from a professional development standpoint and culture and organization standpoint? Certainly training is another area that is very important. The regulatory environment is one of the real constraints right now on the commercial market, although there's been progress here with the FAA. Still trying to sort out exactly how the FAA is going to segment its airspace to allow commercial and personal use drones. This is a big deal, and it's not just a big deal in the United States. It's a big deal that segmenting the airspace is a big deal in Europe. It's a big deal in most places. So getting the regulatory environment right is another area that could be a constraint and also an opportunity for industry to help inform this discussion. Procurement models, again, if you're procuring small personal use unmanned systems, a lot of the times that's commercial off the shelf. Does the U.S. government, the state and local governments have a good way of doing that securely? Again, recalling the DJI example. Is there a good way to do that? Is there a good way to get non-traditional defense companies engaged in a procurement process that can tend to be a lot longer with lower margins than what some of these companies are used to, a lot more complicated than what these companies are used to. So thinking through the procurement process from a government standpoint is absolutely critical, and it's, I know, something the DoD is focused on more and more. Comfort of use, so ethical issues. I mean, autonomous unmanned systems bring up a lot of challenges and questions. The use of unmanned systems by law enforcement for surveillance. Again, these bring up some tricky ethical questions which are not going to be easy to resolve, but they need to be addressed. And they need to be addressed prominently and openly. Allowing companies to be able to make money off of drones, which goes back to the procurement process, really. And then diffusion and technology protection. Again, if a lot of these technologies are developed in the commercial sector, they don't and are sold into military and sold across the military, security forces, commercial entities, civil entities. That technology can get out, And indeed, if you just look at the Chinese designs of their main unmanned systems, they look an awful lot like American designs. And some of that is due to cyber espionage. Some of it is just due to intelligence collection. But we do see these technologies diffuse, some of it intentionally. Again, China co-producing unmanned systems with Pakistan, co-producing unmanned systems with Saudi Arabia, co-producing unmanned systems with other actors. The technology does get out. And so how you control that technology, the technologies you want to control, again, offers a big question for government. And finally, operational concepts. So underlining the difference between technology, capabilities, and effects. How do you use these? What is it that you really want to achieve, and how do you incorporate them? So I'll stop there. I know I've been talking for a while, and hopefully there's some more questions. But thanks very much for your time. I look forward to any follow-up offline as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Tate. This has been very enlightening, and I know maybe we can have you on another one of these to talk more about procurement, specifically in the market, more in like suppliers, et cetera. And that's what I want to just kind of quickly kind of let everybody know, that we don't have time for a demo per se, but we'd encourage you to go to govshop.com and just check out, I can take you there for a second. You can go in, actually we're working with Tate as well as other experts, but in kind of categorizing a lot of the companies within GovShop. So you can go in, for instance, and oops, doesn't look like my, there you go. So for instance, I'm just using unmanned systems. You can see lots of companies in here that come up. You can filter. We're building this out just to kind of give everyone a sense that we're building this out and more the supply base here, but there's already a lot of companies in here, but you can filter. You can see which companies are here in terms of specific contract vehicles. For instance, if I type in unmanned systems here, and you can use different terms, by the way, right? So if I just type in unmanned systems, you see that I know there's a federal supply schedule that came up earlier when I was doing this search. So it's under here, I think under transportation or somewhere here. You can go in and check this out on your own. Sorry, it doesn't seem to be, I'm not, there's a lot here, so I can't say it right off the bat here, but you can go and check out more of this data on govshop.com, and we'll be working with Tate to kind of better classify some of this information, but there's over 1,000 companies already in here. But with that, let me just go back to our slides here. And so I want to say thank you to everyone. You can check out GovShop and Public Spend Forum. Thank you, Tate, for joining us again today and sharing all your insights from London. And hope you're ready to jump to dinner now.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And we'll be sending the information out as a follow-up to this, as always. All right. Thank you again.